Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about westward expansion and sectional conflict by Safaq Amin Nasirin and Khalfa Marin Nesmith. So, if we bring up the term frontier to the average movie addict, you will conjure up in his mind happy visions of painted Indians, gaudily dressed, hurdy-gurdy girls, straight-shooting cowboys, and villainous bad men, all besporting themselves beneath sun-bathed western skies. For example, the ones you come across in old Clint Eastwood films. You have probably seen some of his movies about conquering the Great West with a sense of bravery, adventure, and heroism. He like many ordinary Americans, idolized and still do, in fact, the concept of the American frontier, or perhaps, as you would like to call it, the Far West. The frontier had a share of true romance, but it also helped shape the distinctive civilization of the United States. America's unique characteristic didn't stem from a single source, though. The European heritage, the continuing impact of ideas from abroad, the mingling of people, the spread of the Industrial Revolution, and the growth of class consciousness all contributed. Yet, no force did more to Americanize the nation's people and institutions than the westward expansion. Well, we are here to break the romanticized version, or perhaps the misconceptions, quote unquote, concerning westward expansion by tracing its roots and how it came to result in sectional conflict later. To better understand westward expansion, we first need to understand manifest destiny and expansionism. First of all, the phrase manifest destiny originated in the 19th century, yet the concept behind the phrase originated in the 17th century with the first European immigrant in America, English Protestants or Puritans. Manifest destiny is defined as the concept of American exceptionalism, that is, the belief that America occupies a special place among the countries of the world. The Puritans came to America in 1630, believing that their survival in the New World would be a sign of God's approval. This ideology of manifest destiny continued through the 18th century as victorious America won independence from Great Britain, an event that many occasioned to be preordained and lauded by God and an example of American exceptionalism. Furthermore, 19th century expansionism went hand in hand with the concept of manifest destiny, each signaling that there was a God-given sanctioned right to conquer the land and displace the uncivilized, quote-unquote, non-Christian people who, it was believed, did not take full advantage of the land which had been given to them. To further illustrate this phrase, the painting on the side, painted by John Gast, depicts westward expansion as a difficult task leading to a heavenly reward, represented by the fertile golden valley below. Yet actual pioneers made the overland trek, either by wagon or train, only to discover that the so-called promised land at the end of their journey was a lonely, inhospitable place. In 6 Years on the Border, or Sketchers of Frontier Life, 1883, Mrs. G.B. Rideout describes how her family had left New England for the West because they had heard of a village on the banks of a beautiful river surrounded by a rich country fast filling up with intelligent people. It is important to note the United States did not adopt manifest destiny as a policy. Instead, indeed, the concept of manifest destiny influenced US policy, especially in the last 6 decades of the 19th century, as we will see later on. Moving on to claiming the West. From the moment that Europeans set foot on the North American continent in the 16th century, they began to expand their influence westward. By the mid 18th century, that expansion had progressed to the point that these were 13 British colonies poised on the eastern west of North America, as you can see on the map. These colonies had established themselves over a period of years by fighting a series of quarrels with the Native American inhabitants of the region. By the 1760s, they had largely carved out their geographic boundaries, which generally stretched from the east coast of North America to the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. But the population of these colonies continued to grow, fed not only by the internal population growth, but also by a continued stream of immigration from England and other European countries such as Germany, Holland, Ireland, Scotland, etc. This increased population as well as the deteriorating quality of the soil on eastern farms, but put pressure on the poorly defined western boundaries of these colonies. Up until the end of the War of 1812, the western expansion of the colonies into what is known as the Trans-Appalachian frontier was conducted within a complex struggle among a variety of forces. The French, Spanish, British, colonial Americans, and Native Americans all sought to protect their interest in the area that stretched between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. So, the story of how the colonies expanded westward in the years leading up to the wars of 1812 is one of the political maneuvering, fierce military confrontation, and the steady trickle of settlers carving their homes out of the wilderness. By the end of the War of 1812, the major political obstacles to the United Nations of the USA control of the West had been removed, and a model was set for the continued expansion of the nation westward from the Mississippi River. Moving on to opening the West. To the British, slow and westward expansion made good sense. Further westward immigration could only bring continuing costly wars with the Indians, and the opening of more land for settlers would attract immigrants from England and deplete the labor force there. Moreover, the British feared that if the colonies grew further, they could become ever more difficult to govern. So, the London government issued the Proclamation Act of 1763. The act established the Appalachian Mountain as the western boundary for white settlers. They were basically prohibited to move westward. The colonists, however, had other needs and ideas. The rapid growth of the colonial population in the 70s placed real pressure on the land, as land was divided among growing families and as the fertility of the soil declined after more than a century of use. It became increasingly difficult to support a family on an eastern farm. Accustomed to the open land, American farmers and potential settlers felt that they needed at least 100 acres to support a family. The possession of this amount of land helped make a good citizen, they believed, quote unquote, and was thus essential to colonial life. It only made sense to them that they take possession of the fertile land in the Ohio Valley. Then came the Revolutionary War, and the clash between colonial desires and British demands on the frontier was just one of many factors that led to the war for independence that the colonies waged against England beginning in 1776. Indian tribes saw that their interest lay with the British, and they cooperated with the British in numerous battles along the western frontier. Despite their setbacks in the West, colonial forces prevailed in their way for independence, and the British surrendered in 1783. The 1783 Treaty in Paris granted the newly formed United States of America its independence and all the territory from the Great Lakes south to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Appalachian West to the Mississippi River. This acquired territory was a vast and an ungovernable territory, and the British hoped that despite the treaty, they could continue to exert their influence in the Trans-Appalachian area. profiting from the fur trade and disrupting American settlement. For their part, the Americans looked to the new territory as a land of opportunity, capable of providing the resources needed by the citizens of a growing nation, if only it could be claimed from the Native Americans. The new nation had more than Indians to worry about as it surveyed its western territories. It also had to settle the conflicting claims of the different colonies. When the colonies had first formed, they claimed vast stretches of unsurveyed land. As that land began to be settled, conflicting claims to territories brought many of the colonies into dispute. Following the Revolutionary War, however, Virginia, Connecticut, and Massachusetts handed over their interior holdings to the national government. The holdings included all claims north of the Ohio River and west of Pennsylvania. This region, known as the Northwest Territory or the Old Northwest, allowed the new nation the opportunity to expand in an organized fashion. The national legislature soon passed two laws that were crucial to the history of westward expansion. First, the Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance. The Ordinance of 1785 established a pattern for the surveying and division of all territories westward from the point where the Ohio River leaves the state of Pennsylvania. The entire Northwest Territory was to be surveyed into sections that were to be grouped into townships, and one section was to be set aside for public schools. The effects of this ordinance on the landscape were turn atop the tumult of natural features, leading to the creation of roads, towns, and farms that obeyed the logic of the surveyor's stake rather than the lay of the land. While the Ordinance of 1785 provided for the orderly arrangement of the land, the Northwest Ordinance, also known as the Ordinance of 1787, provided for the orderly establishment of future states. It declared that Northwest Territory would be divided into 3 to 5 territories. Such territories would first be ruled by governors. By a governor, his secretary, and 3 judges, appointed by the national government. When 5,000 free males lived in the territory, elections could be held to form a legislature. When 60,000 free inhabitants were counted, the territory could petition for statehood. The new state would enjoy all the rights and privileges of existing states. The Northwest Ordinance also established a system of laws in the territories, forbade slavery, and guaranteed certain civil rights. 31 of the 35 states west of the Appalachians became states through this process. The Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance attempted to impose order on the growth of the United States, but the actual growth of the nation was far from orderly. There were 2 problems. First, the land was already occupied by Native Americans, many of whom had lived there for centuries. Second, the rush of settlers and land speculators into the newly opened territory defied organization. In order for settlement to progress, the land first had to be claimed from the Indians, who would fight for their right to live in the territory. Then it had to be divided equitably among players of unequal powers. The 3rd article of the Northwest Ordinance made the Indians a promise. The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. In their property, rights, and liberty, they shall never be invaded and disturbed, unless just and lawful wars authorized by Congress, but laws founded on justice and humanity shall from time to time made for preventing wrongs being done to them and for preserving peace and friendship with them. The authors of the ordinance may have meant what they wrote, but in the years to come, every element of their promise to the Indians was broken to or severely distorted. Also, Indian lands were systematically invaded, Indian property was ruthlessly destroyed, and the only laws made were intended to strip Indians of any claim to the land in which they had hunted and lived on for years. Though relations between whites and Native Americans had quieted just after the end of the Revolutionary War, after 1786 hostilities between Americans and Indians on the frontier began to heat up. Some Indian tribes even gathered and began to attack farmsteads in Kentucky, killing as many as one settler per week. President Washington, very aware of that the Indians were receiving encouragement from British troops who had still not left the territory, sent forces to strike against what he called certain banditti of Indians from the northwest side of the Ohio. The Indians had a score of triumphs, and when negotiations failed, Washington sent General Anthony Wayne on a more sustained campaign against the Indian forces. Wayne's forces scored a major victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. The defeat was particularly dispiriting for the Indians because it proved they could not depend on the support of British forces stationed nearby, and it also indicated that the Americans were willing to commit substantial resources to settle in the old Northwest. So, despite their promises that Indians would retain claim to their land, the national and state government were quick to sell off vast tracts of land on which Native Americans were still living. Such land sales brought immediate revenue to governments still struggling to pay off debt accumulated during the Revolutionary War. Land speculators proved to be the biggest purchasers of land. For instance, the Ohio Company of Associates bought 5 million acres of land in southern Acorns at an average price of 20 cents an acre. Wealthy land speculators held on to the land until the prices rose and then sold it for a large profit, so many settlers were unable to purchase land. Soon, legislatures were persuaded to change land scale policies. Here comes the Harrison Land Act of the 1800s. This act allowed settlers to purchase land in parcels as small as 320 acres, a size more suited to family farming. The act also allowed land to be purchased on credit with a fourth of the cost as a down payment, and the remainder due in 4 years. This act, in general, helped encourage an ever-increasing number of immigrants to commit to the difficult life of the pioneer settler. The stream of immigrants began to work its way west during the last years of the 18th century. Settlers tended to usually move due westward from their present location. Thus, the Ohio Valley was settled primarily by the former residents of New England, New York, and Pennsylvania, while the southern Ohio Valley and the Gulf frontier were settled by Virginians, Carolinians, and Georgians. The majority of the settlers intended to farm, but first they had to carve their farms out of the dense forest that covered most of that land. Most such families were self-supporting. For example, they grew beans, squash, and corn, hunted for a living, and fished in the lakes and streams. Farming families usually kept some domestic animals, the most common being pigs because they required no pastures, and settlers found uses for every bit of the animal, from snout to hoofs.
The problem with Spanish control of the Louisiana Territory and New Orleans was removed in a strange twist of diplomatic fate. The United States had long feared that the Spanish would restrict trade along the Mississippi, and the fears were confirmed in 1802 when Spanish authorities barred American traders from using the port of New Orleans. When American authorities protested the closure of the port, they learned that the Louisiana Territory had actually been given to France in the secret Treaty of San Ildefonso 2 years earlier. President Thomas Jefferson instructed diplomat Robert Livingston to negotiate with France for the reopening of the port. In the process of these negotiations, Livingston and James Monroe soon learned that France was interested in selling the entire territory. The two negotiators, surprised by the offer from French ruler Napoleon Bonaparte and acting without authorization from President Jefferson, negotiated the purchase of the Louisiana Territory for about $15 million. Among Jefferson's core principles was the belief in the strict interpretation of the powers granted to the federal government by the United States Constitution. This was known at the time as a constructionalist position, which insisted that the government could exercise only those powers that were specified in the Constitution. Jefferson had accordingly opposed previous attempts to stretch the Constitution, such as Alexander Hamilton's establishment of the Bank of the United States. Because the Constitution did not mention the establishment of a central banking system, he insisted that the creation of such a bank was forbidden. Yet, many of Jefferson's contemporaries, as well as some historians since, denounce his authorization of the Louisiana Purchase as contrary to his own strict constructionalist views. Critics have argued, then and since, that Jefferson acted hypocritically when he decided to purchase Louisiana. Despite the fact that the Constitution did not grant the federal government authority to annex parts of foreign territories. Others, like Jefferson himself did, believed that sometimes the practical best interests of the country might override constitutional theory and one's own personal beliefs. Jefferson had long, in fact, recognized the importance of Western lands and the Mississippi River in particular. He envisioned the United States as a continental empire populated by small farmers who would use the Mississippi River as a major highway for commerce. As a matter of fact, Thomas Jefferson called his election to the presidency the revolution of 1800s, and his supporters believed that his victory could bring a dramatic change in the character of the nation, a retreat, they called, from Hamilton's dreams of a powerful developing nation, and a return to an ideal of a simple agrarian republic. But American society was changing rapidly, making it basically virtually impossible for the Jeffersonian dream to prevail. The nation's population was expanding and diversifying. Its cities were growing and its commercial life was becoming even more important. And in 1803, Jefferson himself, as we've seen just now, made one of the most important contributions to the growth of the United States, the Louisiana Purchase, which dramatically expanded the physical boundaries of the nation and which began extending white settlement deeper and deeper into the continent. The War of 1812 and economic growth. All of the territory in the world would do Americans no good if they could not control it. And in the years leading up to the War of 1812, the United States came to realize that it must once again fight England to defend its rights as a sovereign nation. The War of 1812 is often called the Second War for Independence, for despite granting the United States its independence in 1783, the British continued to station British forces in the Northwest Territory and encourage Indian attacks on United States settlements. And after 1805, as part of the war effort against the French, the British repeatedly disrupted U.S. shipping to France. Though the shipping and trade issues became the main subject of diplomatic negotiations, many historians agree that the real cause of the war between the United States and Britain was that the United States desire to secure control of its western territories and prevent further British meddling on the continent. The so-called war hawks, members of Congress from the western states, even hoped that they could take control of Canada from the British, thus furthering expanding American control. Those in the West also saw the war as a legitimate way to drive troublesome Indians off the land Americans really wanted. The war was finally settled in 1814 on terms that were favorable to the United States. As we have discussed, the War of 1812 produced chaos in shipping and banking, and it exposed dramatically the inadequacy of the nation's existing transportation and financial systems. So, after the war, there were new efforts to strengthen the national economic development. In other terms, the end of the War of 1812 allowed the US to resume its economic growth and territorial expansion. In fact, the wartime experience underlined the need for another national bank. After the expiration of the first bank's charter, a large number of state banks had issued vast quantities of banknotes, creating a confusing variety of currency of widely differing value. It was difficult to tell what a banknote was really worth, and counterfeiting was really easy. In response to these problems, Congress chartered a second bank of the United States in 1816 with more capital. Moreover, after the war, Congress acted to promote manufacturing in the country by cutting off imports. Before the War of 1812, British ships swarmed into American ports and unloaded cargoes of manufactured goods, many priced below cost. In response, in 1816, Congress passed a tariff law, or the so-called protective tariff, that effectively limited competition from abroad on a wide range of items, including cotton cloth. As a matter of fact, the American textile industry in particular had grown dramatically. Before the war, the textile factories, most of them stationed in New England, produced only yarn and thread, and families operating handlooms at home did the actual weaving of cloth. Then, Americans, after examining textile machinery in England, developed a power loom better than its English counterpart. So, in conclusion, the end of the War of 1812 suddenly dimmed the prospects of many American and the American industry as a whole. Transportation and westward expansion. So, the nation's next most pressing economic need was a better transportation system to link the vast territories of the growing United States. Soon, an old question came back. Should the federal government help finance roads and other internal improvements? The idea of using government funds to finance road building was not really a new one. When Ohio entered the Union in 1803, the federal government agreed that part of the proceeds from the sale of public lands there should finance road construction. And in fact, in 1807, Congress enacted the law proposed by the Jefferson administration that permitted using revenues from Ohio land sales to finance a national road from the Potomac River to the Ohio Valley. Around the same time, steam-powered shipping was expanding rapidly. By 1816, river steamers were sailing up the Mississippi to the Ohio River and up the Ohio as far as Pittsburgh. Steamboats, as the one pictured in the slide, were soon carrying more cargo on the Mississippi than all the earlier forms of river transportation, like flatboats, barges, and others. So, you may ask, how did steamboats contribute to the development of the economy? Well, they stimulated the agricultural economy of the West and the South by providing cheaper access to markets, and they enabled Eastern manufacturers to send their finished goods west much more readily and rapidly. Steamboats soon and quickly became a symbol of the West. As such, Westerners continuously sought to improve and decorate the boats. In competition for passengers, they began to offer luxurious cabins and built ornate lounges on board. The elegance of these steamboats served as a reassurance to Westerners that they were not the primitive backwards painted by the Eastern press. Part 2. Sectional conflict, sectionalism. Territorial expansion and the conflict it provoked are intertwined threads running through early U.S. history. When the Revolutionary War concluded in 1783, the country's western border was the Mississippi River, and most of the land west of the Appalachian Mountains was controlled by Native Americans. 70 years later, however, within a lifetime, U.S. territory reached the Pacific Ocean and encompassed all of the modern-day lower 48 states. Through purchase, conquest, and diplomacy, early American leaders forged a continental republic. The process, however, was not smooth. It took white people several more decades to take complete control of the land from Native Americans. And that was only one of several conflicts over America's breathtaking growth. As they battled indigenous people, white Americans also clashed with each other over the reward of expansion. There were questions such as how should the land be distributed, who should benefit from it, how should the territory be governed, and who should make all of these decisions. And slavery's presence only intensified these debates. When the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, African slavery existed in every single state. But the northern and southern regions soon diverged sharply, and the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland, surveyed in the 1760s by Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, became the famous frontier between slave and free oil, as you can see clearly on the map. How did the difference between the North and South grow? Well, at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, James Madison had already noticed that the real difference of interest lay between the northern and southern states, with the institution of slavery and its consequences in forming the line of discrimination between them. That difference Madison talked about grew even more intense in the following decades. North of the Mason-Dixon line, where slave populations were small and plantations rare, slavery faded away. Between 1780 and 1804, every northern state outlawed slavery. However, emancipation was painfully slow. In Pennsylvania, for instance, no slaves were immediately freed under the abolition law passed in 1780. Liberation began with the children subsequently born to enslaved mothers, who had to serve as indentured servants until their 20th birthday. But the northern trend away from slavery was clear. By the mid-19th century, Northerners took pride in their free labor society. They celebrated the dignity and upward mobility available, in theory at least, to every worker. They believed that this was the foundation of a moral, prosperous, and progressive society. They wanted to recreate that society in the West, and they suspected that the absence of free labor explained why things were so disturbingly different in the South. However, residents of both regions were keenly interested in the West. Environmental factors like climate mattered, but did not automatically determine whether slave or free labor would prevail. Take Missouri and Illinois, for instance. They both lay on roughly the same line of latitude, but they followed different historical paths. Despite efforts to cement slavery in Illinois, it became a free state, thanks in part to Governor Edward Cole's determination to block a pro-slavery revision of the state's constitution. Despite efforts to ban slavery from Missouri, it became a slave state after intense congregational deliberation. Therefore, slavery status, you could say, depended on political power and human decision-making. Early on, the practice of dividing the West in half was thanks to the previously mentioned Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Partition even grew more intense out of this law. It was an enormously important law which established a procedure for managing the territories or lands owned by the U.S. that were not states and for creating new states for them. Now, how come a territory became a state? Well, statehood would follow several stages of territorial governance. Initially, Congress would appoint a governor who would manage the territory until its population of free, white, adult males reached 5,000. Then, these voters could elect a representative assembly empowered to pass laws, though they could be vetoed by the governor. This second, more democratic phase lasted until the territorial population reached 60,000, at which point the territory could enter the Union as a state equal to the original 13. It is important to note, however, that the ordinance also banned slavery from the entire Northwestern Territory. Years later, debates over Congress' power to prohibit slavery in the territory were fierce, but it sparked no controversy in 1787. The question of Missouri. Soon, subsequent expansion triggered new debates about slavery's growth. The next political battleground was Louisiana Territory, the vast territory acquired through the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Slavery had been legal there under French rule, and the state of Louisiana entered the Union with slavery in 1812. But the fiercest controversy over Louisiana Purchase lands erupted 7 years later when Missouri applied for statehood. Well, most of the inhabitants of Missouri came from Virginia and Kentucky, and they sought admission as a slave state. Many northern congressmen, however, objected to this. They were not racial egalitarians, but they did worry about slaveholders' political power. After all, a Virginia slave owner had been president for the last 18 years. They thought to themselves, admit Missouri, and the Electoral College would tilt further in the South's favor. Just so you know, there was a balance between slave and free states in the Senate, with 11 of each admit Missouri, and the South would gain a 2-seat majority. Northern critics also opposed expanding slavery within a republic founded on ideas of natural rights and equality. They thought to themselves, was slavery really compatible with republican government? Was it really consistent with the Declaration of Independence that declared that all men are created equal? Well, opponents of slavery expansion backed a proposal by James Talmadge of New York to admit Missouri under conditions that would eventually transform it into a free state in the long run. The proposal stated that no new slaves could be introduced into Missouri, and all children born to enslaved mothers would be emancipated at age 25. Through another agonizingly slow process, this eventually would have ended slavery in Missouri. Predictably, of course, Southern congressmen with some Northern allies denounced this plan as insulting and unconstitutional. They thought to themselves, what right had Congress to place conditions on admission of a new state, and what right had representatives from one region to pass judgment on another? So, as the debate intensified, the focus shifted from Missouri to the deeper issue of slavery in the American Republic. For instance, anti-slavery congressmen who previously held their tongues now vented their feelings. They expressed their hatred of slavery in every shape and demanded that the government work never to encourage but always to control the evil of slavery. For them, it was absurd for a country which declared that all men are created equal with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to promote slavery. Pro-slavery people, however, made aggressive claims. They stated that slaves were, quote, happy and well treated. They declared if slavery expanded widely, lower population densities would make rebellions less likely. Others deemed slavery as a beneficial institution, a positive good. The Missouri Compromise of 1850. The debate was fierce. Congressmen traded insults and spoke of secession and war, but peacemakers soon settled the dispute with a familiar formula: division of the Louisiana Purchase in two, with slavery outlawed in the northern portion and accepted in the southern portion. As you can see on the following map, the red line separating the free states from the slave states. According to the Missouri Compromise, Missouri became a slave state in 1821, but was balanced by the admission of Maine as a free state. Some observers, however, worried about carving the country in half. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, warned that a geographical line coinciding with a marked principle, moral and political, would never be obliterated, but would be marked deeper and deeper in future quarrels. And he turned out to be right. Sectional conflict and the Mexican-American War. A generation later, a third era of expansion provoked another bitter dispute, mainly because of the Mexican-American War. Well, even before the war concluded in 1848, American territorial ambitions, especially for the strategic harbor of San Francisco, indicated that victory would bring new acreage under the U.S. flag. Very much like Jefferson earlier, the New England philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson warned that the U.S. might win, but it will be as the man swallows the arsenic, which brings him down in turn. Mexico will poison us, he said, and indeed he was right. Soon, debates over slavery came back. It followed patterns with some new twists. Opponents of slavery expansion united behind a proposal introduced in 1846 by Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania to ban slavery from all territory acquired in the war. However, and predictably indeed, pro-slavery Southerners rejected the so-called Wilmot Proviso. They insisted that slaveholders have equal access to territory for which they had paid a share of the cost in blood and treasure. They argued Congress had no power to prohibit slavery from a territory. They believed that the federal government, acting on the state's behalf, would uphold the rights of slaveholders in all Western territories. Northerners, however, looked at things differently. Slavery was illegal in Mexico, so they thought to themselves, how would it look for the U.S. to capture land and then establish slavery in it? Free white workers needed opportunity to move west. Should they have to compete with aristocratic slaveholders or labor alongside slaves? Well, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848 ended the war, debate over the newly won Mexican secession escalated. The discovery of gold in Northern California and a migration of thousands of 49ers raised the stakes by putting California on a fast track to statehood. A brewing border conflict between Texas and the future New Mexico only added fuel to the fire. The status of slavery in new territories created out of the Mexican cession provoked controversy. Whose interests should American expansion serve? Gold miners, free workers, slaveholders, or all? All Americans, were deeply divided over the future of the Continental Republic. Well, the debate became only bitter. For instance, Vermont Senator William Upham introduced a petition against any expansion of slavery, described quote, as a crime against humanity and a sore evil in the body politic. Southerners denounced slavery critics as rabble-rousing fanatics and demanded it expand throughout the West. Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, however, described slavery as, quote, blessing, which had brought Africans into Christian land where civilization would elevate and dignify them. People like Jefferson Davis thought to themselves, why limit the spread of such a beneficial system? Why limit slavery? Because slavery, after all, was ideal for mining and other frontier labor, he insisted. The concept of popular sovereignty. How could any compromise bridge the gap between people like Upham and people like Davis? Well, despite the difficulty, people from both sections scrambled to save the Union. There were two possible solutions to the territorial problem. Plan A was to extend the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific Ocean. The second plan was a clear favorite among Northern Democrats, who loved territorial expansion but dreaded sectional conflict. This was the doctrine of popular sovereignty. Proponents of the latter argued to remove the issue of slavery expansion from Congress because it is dangerously divisive and not properly under congregational authority. Leave it up to voters in each territory instead to decide for themselves. For example, Michigan Democrat Lewis Cass argued that the federal government must allow territorial residents to regulate their internal concerns in their own way. Popular sovereignty resonated with American ideas of self-government. Why should Western pioneers not have the same rights as Easterners? And for political moderates who feared that the debate over slavery endangered the Union, popular sovereignty offered a practical solution. The Union, after all, would be a safe place if territorial voters rather than Congress could decide. So, theoretically, popular sovereignty provided politicians with a convenient way to circumvent the slavery debate, maintain party unity, and promote sectional harmony. In practice, however, it did not really work, because the practical details of popular sovereignty were vague. Who exactly were the people of the territory? How long must a migrant live there before his vote counted? Years passed, and in 1854, Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois hoped to once again employ the principles of popular sovereignty in order to address the slavery debate, this time, however, in the Kansas and Nebraska territories. So, in January of that year, Senator Douglas introduced a bill that divided the land immediately west of Missouri into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. He argued in favor of popular sovereignty to decide if slavery would be legal there. To Douglas' dismay, dissatisfaction came from all sides. Anti-slavery supporters in particular were outraged because, under the terms of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, slavery would have been outlawed in both territories since they were both north of the dividing line between slave and free states. So, almost immediately, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed to Kansas, each side hoping to determine the results of the first election held after the law went into effect. And the conflict turned violent, earning the nickname of Bleeding Kansas. Soon, the border between Kansas and Missouri became a hotbed of violence and intimidation, resulting in voter fraud and several antithetical constitutions proposed in Kansas. This act further aggravated the split between the North and South on the issue of slavery, until reconciliation seemed virtually impossible. So, in the aftermath and within the context of growing sectionalism and conflicts over slavery, popular sovereignty was a victim of extremist politics that erased hopes for peace. So basically, this concept of popular sovereignty, rather than preserving the Union, it instead led to further violence that pushed the nation towards civil war later on.
To conclude, the westward expansion of the United States was a pivotal moment in American history, shaping the nation's identity and fueling economic growth. However, this expansion was not without its challenges, as the issues of slavery and sectional conflict created tensions that would ultimately lead to the Civil War. While the westward expansion brought opportunities for settlement and development, it also highlighted the deep-rooted division within American society. As the nation moved towards its future, it would need to confront these challenges and find a way to overcome them in order to achieve greater unity and progress. The legacy of the westward expansion and sectional conflict serves as a reminder of the importance of understanding and addressing complex issues in our society.